There was a book that I have had in my electronic library for a while, and it's, maybe about 3 months or something. And while I had an opportunity to haul Grace and her friend to Phoenix a few weeks ago for her to go check out one of the colleges there, I had this opportunity to look down through my library and just kind of maybe put some more books into a reading order. And I saw this one was there, and I thought, I keep meaning to read this. And it's a short read. It only took about an hour and a half to get through because it's not a very long book. But it's kind of thought-provoking. And it's a good, concise summary of looking at the character of God through the nouns that describe God. We will oftentimes use adjectives and verbs, and I know this isn't like a grammar lesson, but sometimes it's helpful to go back through Scripture and look at the nouns. In other words, what is God? What kind of things are used to describe what He is? And the author of this book picks a handful of those and concentrates in on them kind of heavily, and it's interesting. And so really for us, I think for some it will just be kind of a reminder, refresher of some things that are easily forgotten. For others, it may be something that you've never heard before. And hopefully for all of us, there will just be something we can take away that will help us continue to see it a little more clearly as we go through days like today, times like now. So I do think that there is some value in rehearsing the basics sometimes, because it seems like the world would like to shift us off of that as often as it possibly can. The name of the book is Who God Is, and I threw some information up there for you. It's less than 100 pages long. It's really short. It's available in hardback or Kindle edition. Digital I would recommend if you have it. You can go pick it up. Ben Witherington is a scholar and professor for New Testament, but he also works across all of Scripture. If you have ever spent any time watching documentaries on, say, the Science Channel or the History Channel that involve anything in and around the Bible, you have probably heard Ben. He kind of has a deep voice. He speaks with a lot of authority. He's on a lot of documentaries out there. He was talking about one. I was listening to a podcast, and they had flown him out to New York and interviewed him for 3 hours for this 3-part series that Discovery Channel was doing, and they ended up using only one word from his 3 hours, and that was no. That was it. But they flew him out and paid for his trip and all that. He's a good guy. He really is, and he's kind of profound. His background is actually English literature and English, so he's a good writer. But this is kind of what we're going to look at, and he breaks it down into about 6 or 7 different topic areas of who God is. And like I said, it's a good read. It will make you think about some things, and being fewer than 100 pages should be pretty easy for you to get through. So I'd encourage you to do that. And one of the things that we're going to start with, the one we're going to start with, is love. Love is where he begins, because love is the character trait, is the thing that defines God most often from cover to cover. It's love, and it's summed up really in this way, in that God is love, and those are going to be the verses that we're going to look at today. And that can get confused with God is loving, which He is. That is absolutely true. But in this case, from this perspective, what we're going to look at today is the definition of what God is. And God, above all things, is love. And love turns out to be, Jesus says this, it's the greatest commandment, love God and love your neighbor. But some other authors within the New Testament do something else with love when they're discussing it with us. They'll say things like, love is greater than faith, and love is greater than hope. Stop and think about that for just a minute. We are a people of faith. Our belief system is such that people need to have faith and trust and hope in God through Jesus, that is kind of an essential to our belief system. But the Apostle Paul, when he's writing, will write and say that love actually supersedes faith. It rests in the number one spot of all things. And so while we'll talk about it a lot and we'll mention this often, we don't, I think, stop to think about it, what that really means. And so it begs the question, I think a fair question, which is, why did God give His love? Why does He give that to us? And authors, through the New Testament especially, will say that God has given us, He has poured out love to us. And there's an expectation that we should pour out that love to others. Why is that? What is so key and critical about that? So we're going to just unpack this. Why did God give this to us? Just a little bit, and discover why some of these authors would say this. And hopefully, again, like I said, it might be a reminder for some, maybe brand new for some others. So we're going to be looking at first John. John, the Apostle John, same author of Revelation, same author of the Gospel of John. We're going to be looking at his writings, his New Testament writings to the church, and they're very black and white in his statements, but when you read between the statements, there's this area that just opens up for you to really think about. And so we're going to look at that today. 1 John chapter 4. I invite you to open up a Bible, turn one on, or follow along on the screen. We'll have it up there for you too. And here we go. I actually changed the first intro word. It says "Dear friends" in the New Living Translation, but I changed it back to "beloved" for a reason. You'll see that here in just a minute. Dear beloved, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God, but anyone who does not love does not know God. Some of you have read this before. How many of you remember reading this? There's a handful of hands. It's a reminder. Love becomes this definition, this definer, almost like this line in the sand. When you begin to read John, he's pretty clear about this, right? If you love, well, then you can claim to be a child of the living God. But if you do not love, you can't claim it. That's a pretty black and white thing, right? Why is that, John? Why is it that you define it that way? Well, God is love. In other words, if you and I are going to represent this living divine being that we say we represent, and He is love, and we don't show that, we don't do any of that, then how can you claim to be a follower? How can you claim to be a part of it? This is John's approach. And I will tell you, this is not good material to read when you're really mad at people or the world. In other words, if you're having a bad day and you don't really like anybody, this is not encouraging material to read. Because, it's pretty hardcore. It's pretty in your face, isn't it? And I think that it's important, when John's writing this, it's important for his readers who are reading this, because they're having struggles within their church. They're trying to figure out how to live in and among people from very diverse and different belief systems and backgrounds. They're trying to figure out how to do this. One of the most stark differences is you have Jewish believers who are a part of these groups, and you have Greek, Roman believers who are part of these groups, former pagans, and their cultures, they're bringing their cultures into the faith, and it's hard for them to like one another, let alone love one another. And there's battles between them too. And so John is writing to these folks to say, look, you have to be able to express and love one another. That's the God that we serve. He is love. And John's really particular. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but I feel like it's kind of important, because that word love in our culture is very nebulous. I heard Kara say not long ago, "I love pizza." It wasn't until that evening that she said she loved me. You see what I'm saying? I've not, maybe in our culture there are people who love pizza enough to marry it and start a life with it and try to, but we use the same word, love. Man, I love it when that happens. What? Payday. Do you see how it can get confusing? What on earth, when it says God is love and love one another, what does John mean? In our culture, in our context, in our words, what does it mean? And I will tell you this, that I think most of the time it means a different word than what John wrote, and that is lust. Most of the time we think it's about lusting after things. Now, I know that's an old word too. Some of you might be too young to even know what that word means. I'll let you look it up on your own. That means you have a phone and you can search it for yourselves. But within the Greek language that John is using, he has a selection of several words. One is eros, which is kind of where we get the word erotica. One is agape, which was a word that was rarely used in the Greek culture. It wasn't a widely used word. It was, in fact, Jewish authors of the Jewish Hebrew Bible, right? They changed it into Greek. They sort of grabbed a hold of this word agape, which meant a different kind of love, almost like a dedicated love, almost like something that you would, like a loyal love is more the meaning of the term agape. Well, the authors who were converting from Hebrew to Greek, they sort of took that word, and the authors of the New Testament continued on the tradition with that word, agape. But most of the words that were used for love in this time, especially when you're talking within a pagan culture, were eros, erotic. And they are very different. I'll give you a sense. Okay, pizza was kind of an idea. Eros means you're loving something with the understanding that it will benefit you somehow. There is something expected in return. It's a part of the transaction of you giving eros to something. So you can give your eros to Netflix, and Netflix will give you entertainment. You can give your eros to pizza, and pizza will give you a good taste and a good feeling. You follow? You follow how that works? Money, right? You can have that kind of love, that eros for money, because it gives you certain things. There's a payback that comes with it. Sex is another one, right? How it's typically we say, well, it's a two-way street. But honestly, when we start to think about that kind of transaction, sexual transactions, if we're honest, we're kind of in it for ourselves. It's eros. Agape is not that way. Agape is sacrificing. It's giving something away, right? So there's two different kinds of love. And so when we say God is love, He's agape. He's the kind who gives something away with no expectation of return. And when He asks us to say, you need to love others, it's no expectation of return. And it's important to understand those terms, those differences going on. God showed how much He loved us by sending His one and only Son into the world so that we might have eternal life through Him. This is real love, John says. Not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. Dear beloved, dear agape, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love each other. No one has ever seen God, but, and this is important, if we love each other, God lives in us, and His love is brought to a full expression in us. This is one of the few times an author tells you and I how we can show people God. I wish I could see God. And John is writing to his audience saying, if you want people to see God, if you want to show them God, then love, agape, your brothers and sisters. And wherever you see that happening, you're looking at God. Even though you can't see it, you're seeing God's love. You're seeing it. That's a profound thing, isn't it? When you stop and think about it, when you and I sacrificially love someone, that is a full expression. Think about that. A full expression. Most people think of a full expression of God as being like fire, brimstone, judgment from heaven on people. We want to see God come and reign and do. But in this case, John is saying, by the way, that's the same author of Revelation, of the fire, brimstone thing, is saying the full expression, if you want to fully see God, love, agape, your brothers and sisters. That's how important it is. It's crazy. Crazy hard to do, too. Now, I could sum all this up that way, but there's a video that can sum this up really well. So we're going to watch a quick little video from the Bible Project, and then we're going to wrap up the rest of this out of here, because those guys can just do things way better than, well, anybody else I know. So let's watch this for just a second.
So if you've heard of Jesus, you probably know about one of his famous teachings called the Golden Rule. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. And this, actually, is a restatement of something else that Jesus said, that the meaning of life is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's really beautiful, but what does he mean exactly by the word love? It's an unclear word in English, because you can love your mom and you can love pizza. And if the word love means the same thing in both of those cases, your mom's going to feel real bad. So what did Jesus mean in his language? Well, first of all, this love your neighbor phrase is a quotation from the Hebrew scriptures, where the word for love is ahava. However, the language Jesus spoke and taught in from day to day, it was a cousin language of Hebrew, that is Aramaic, in which the word for love is rachma. But then, as Jesus' followers spread his teachings around the world, they translated them into Greek, using the word agape. But here's what's fascinating. The earliest followers of Jesus, who wrote the books of the New Testament in Greek, they didn't learn the meaning of agape by looking it up in ancient dictionaries. Rather, they looked to the teachings of Jesus and the story of his life to redefine their very concept of love. So, one time, Jesus was asked about the most important command in the Jewish scriptures. And he first quoted from the ancient prayer in the Torah called the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart. So, love for God is the most important thing. But then Jesus quickly followed up by saying another command from the Torah was also the most important, to love your neighbor as yourself. So, which is the most important, loving God or loving your neighbor? Jesus' answer is yes. To ask the question means you don't get his point. For Jesus, they are two sides of the same coin. Your love for God will be expressed by your love for people, and vice versa, they're inseparable. And so this makes it clear that for Jesus, agape love is not primarily a feeling for someone else that happens to you, like our phrase, I fell in love. For Jesus, love is action. It's a choice that you make to seek the well-being of people other than yourself. Jesus also went on to teach that genuine love for God and others means seeking people's well-being without expecting anything in return, especially from people who are in difficult situations, who can't repay you even if they wanted to. According to Jesus, this kind of generous love reflects the very heartbeat of God. And he took this even further. Jesus said that the ultimate standard of authentic love is how well you treat the person that you can't stand. Or in his words, you shall love your enemy and do good to them, expecting nothing in return. For Jesus, this kind of enemy-embracing love imitates the very character of God himself. Now, we wouldn't be talking about Jesus still today if he had only said things like love your enemy. This is how he actually lived. Jesus was constantly helping and serving the people around him in very practical and tangible ways. And he consistently moved towards poor and hurting people who couldn't benefit him in return. He showed love for the forgotten ones, the people who usually fall through the cracks. And when Jesus eventually marched into Jerusalem, he made himself an enemy of the leaders of his people by accusing them of hypocrisy and corruption. But then instead of attacking his enemies to overthrow them, he allowed them to kill him. Jesus died for the selfishness and corruption of his enemies because he loved them. After Easter morning, Jesus and then his followers claimed that it was the power of God's love for the world that was revealed in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. As the Apostle Paul put it, God demonstrated his own agape for us in this: while we were still sinners, the Messiah died for us. Or in the words of the Apostle John, God's own agape was revealed when he sent his one and only Son into the world so that through him we could have life. And for John, then, this leads naturally to the conclusion: beloved ones, if that's how God has loved us, then we ought to show love for one another. So Christian faith involves trusting that at the center of the universe is a being overflowing with love for his world, which means that the purpose of human existence is to receive this love that has come to us in Jesus and then to give it back out to others, creating an ecosystem of others-focused, self-giving love. And that's the New Testament meaning of agape love.
John will go on to say, God is love, and all who live in love live in God. And God lives in them, and as we live in God, our love grows more perfect. It takes time. You don't come out of the gate knowing it right off the bat. So we will not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. It's, again, for many of us, this is a basic reminder, but I think it's a good reminder in our day. Because I don't think, when he says perfected in love, I don't think there's any particular day in your life at some stage or age where loving other people becomes easier. It will constantly be a challenge. Because we're in this tug-of-war fight where we want to get something in return. And this fear sometimes that we have, that we don't want to give away this love, can come from a myriad of sources. Sometimes we think, if you're more ethereal about it, you might think, well, maybe I'm not loving correctly. But I think for many of us, the fear is that people are going to use us. They're just going to take advantage of us. And I think it's relevant. This love that grows more perfect, as it turns out, when we love with agape love, it has this really strange effect. It says that this kind of love that we love with doesn't have any fear in it. In fact, it's the kind of love that can expel all fear. Did you catch that? All fear. Now, the writer is not specific about what he means by all and fear. He just lumps it together. And what this means for me as I read through this, and I think for all of us as we read this, is in a time like today where there's plenty to fear, walking in God's agape, in his love, is a way to walk not in a risk-free world, but to walk on our world unafraid, to walk on our world with confidence. And that does not mean that this is some magic immunity. You understand? This is God's agape love is not like a vaccination against risk. Every one of these apostles, save John, that we're aware of from tradition, died a horrible death. They all walked in God's love. It's not an antidote to the dangers of this world. But when we're walking in God's love, we understand that we are willing to sacrifice, make sacrifices on behalf of others, understanding that the risk is we won't get anything in return for it. And it allows you and I to walk through the world without fear. That's why I think some can look at the current situations around us and go, look, it's another day. We're in a hard, horrible time in our world. And there's been a tremendous loss of life, and it's horrific. But I can walk through this time without any fear. Or let's say, with less fear. It's hard to walk and be perfect, isn't it? They're valid, these fears, but love purges this fear. And it says, if we are afraid, well, it's for fear of punishment. And this shows that we have not fully experienced His perfect love. We love each other because He loved us first. And in essence, what John is saying is, if you're concerned, if you're afraid that you have to perform and do something in a particular certain way, otherwise God's going to reject you, then John would very kindly look at you and say, then you don't get it. Then you don't understand. Because it doesn't work this way. Don't you see? God gave everything first, gives it to you, and then says, you go and do the same thing. He didn't ask or expect perfection to begin with. And thank goodness. Otherwise, my mom wouldn't have made it. It'll take you guys a minute to catch up on that one. If someone says, I love God, but hates a fellow believer, that person is a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God who we can't see? And He has given us this command, that those who love God must also love their brothers and sisters. And this is challenging to do. And again, John just repeats, this is how you see God in your world. Where you see God's love, that agape, you're watching God at work. That's amazing. That's astounding. Do you realize that means that you have the power, you have the ability to bring God into any situation? You can bring Him and invite Him in by showing the kind of sacrificial love, loving other people in spite of themselves. You can bring God into that situation just by doing that. That's astounding. Think about that. It's amazing. You don't have to pray to ask God to come. You can just bring love into it, and God shows up. That's crazy. All right. This was from the book. When starting with love, one may quickly realize God's desire to be in community with His creation. I agree with that. But that's not the end-all, be-all goal. Rather, He wants us, followers, to reflect this loving character one to another. That's the goal. The goal is that we begin to behave based on what we say we believe. And when we don't behave based upon the way we say we believe, John would say, you're essentially fooling yourself. And that's a hard message to hear, because it's really easy right now to be divided. It's really easy to put other people in categories that we can just, follow this, put other people in categories that we can just entirely dismiss. It's really easy to do today. But according to this author of the New Testament, that is absolutely not allowed under any circumstances, ever. God's intent is that we will reflect that character of His. Here's another way to say it. Agape was given to give away. God gave it with the expectation that you will give it. I mean, that's how we received it. Think about that. It was given. Did you earn God's love? Go ahead and have the courage to raise your hand if you're here and you earned God's love, because I'd like to talk to you about how you did that. God freely gave his agape. He freely gave his love. Why would we ever want to hold on to that? I don't think any of us do. I think we get confused about what type of love we're talking about. And anytime we put the love of God in the category of I'm going to do something to get something in return, you've shifted to erotic. Now that may sound strange to your ears, but I'm saying it in the essence of the ancient language. We've shifted to a love that says, I expect to be repaid for what I have done. And guess what happens when you don't get paid back? Disappointment, anger, frustration, fear, all of that comes forward. And can we just be really honest? In our closest loving relationships, that's an easier place at times to show agape love. But for those of you who have been in intimate relationships, if you think back to the last time you had that kind of anger and tension, it was probably because somebody in that relationship wanted something that they weren't getting. And they felt like they had put time and effort into it, but they weren't getting the payout out of it. And at some point, that erupts. That is not agape. And I'm not suggesting that you stay in bad relationships with people that are hurtful, that are evil or violent. None of that. I'm saying when it comes to general relationships, when it comes to love, God's love is a one-way transaction. Every time. If you're giving it with the expectation of something coming back, you are not in God's love. You get it? Make sense? Not easy. I think this is important. We'll wrap up on this. I think this is important today because this kind of love that God is describing is not the kind of love that we have seen much of. It's not the kind of love that the world has seen. And we have an opportunity. This is a interesting time. We have an opportunity to capitalize on what God has given us. And that's his love, his agape, in our world. We do have an opportunity to do that today. And I know people will want to take advantage of that, but that's okay. Here's why I can say that's okay. God apparently doesn't run out of love because it's what he's made of. So, my challenge would be try to exhaust God's love. Try. Other authors in the New Testament will say he'll just fill you up, sometimes so much that it just spills out of you. And those are the people that really irritate you when you're having a bad day. You ever been around that person who's just full of God's love and joy and you're trying to have a bad day? Come on. Well, I'm telling you, the world's kind of having a bad day, and I would love to be a part of the party that irritates them with God's love. That would be a good place to be. This agape that we give away doesn't belong to us. It was given to be given away. And people need this. They need it right now. People are going to be trying to return to normal. And normal for most people is, I'm going to love you with the expectation that I'm going to get something back. And when they see someone who loves them just because they're human, you will stand out in a big way. We have this great opportunity, this time that we have. I don't want to return to the world of eros type of love. I want to go to a world where it's given freely with no expectation. And I can't really imagine what that would look like because I've not seen it. I've seen it in small groups and within certain relationships, but within greater communities in the world, it can happen, but it's going to take us to start to do that. And that's the challenge of God as love that I think is laid before our feet today.